They called her a witch and tied the rope around her neck. The crowd spat curses, but Josie Marrow just stared back, eyes dark as the grave they dug for her. One bullet cracked the gallows, and a ghost in black leather rode straight through the noose. "Hang her if you dare," Colt Everhart growled, smoke curling from his rifle. No one spoke when he lifted her into his saddle, her silence louder than any scream. Some said she'd burn like her mother. But that morning, Penance Ridge watched two outlaws vanish into dust, and they'd never fear her silence the same way again. "You saved me once," he whispered. "Now it's my turn." They said Josie Marrow came into this world without so much as a cry. The midwife swore the baby's eyes opened too wide, too knowing for a newborn. The old wives in Penance Ridge took one look at that hush and named it a curse. Her mother, Clara Marrow, had died swinging from the same crooked oak that would one day hold Josie's rope. They'd called Clara a witch too, burned her herbs, tore apart her small garden of roots and jars, but they never burned her spirit. The town said Clara's ghost walked the ridge at night, whispering secrets to her silent daughter. Josie grew up on the edge of things. The town, the law, people's patience. She never spoke, not one word, though the children dared her to behind the church. Some claimed she could talk to the trees instead. They'd see her in the woods at dawn, bare feet damp with creek water, palms pressed to the soil as if listening for something deeper than voices. When fevers swept through the settlement, folks came crawling to her cabin at the edge of the ridge. They never thanked her outright, just left a tin of coins on her porch and avoided her eyes. Josie never asked for coin anyway. She learned what roots dulled the heat under the ribs, which bitter leaves made coughs loosen their claws. If she could not cure her own loneliness, she could at least cure the sick. They said a witch should never be trusted with blood and bone, but some things even superstition cannot mend alone. There was an old trapper once, name half gone to whiskey and win, who stumbled to her door with rot eating through his leg. Josie worked by candlelight for 3 nights, cutting out the infection, packing the wound with boiled bark and strips of her own bedsheet. On the 4th morning, the old man knew the land would take him anyway. His breath rattled like dry leaves. He reached up, placed a dirt-cracked hand on Josie's cheek, and his eyes glimmered with a fear deeper than death. "You'll see too much, girl," he rasped, voice crumbling. "You'll see too much, and they'll burn you for it." Josie didn't flinch. She only pressed his hand to her face a moment longer, silent as always. Before they ever whispered Colt Everhart's name like a curse in Penance Ridge, they called him the Grave Hand, a ghost in spurs who never missed and never left any soul behind to tell the tale. He rode for whoever had the gold to buy a bullet, no loyalty except to the weight of coin in his saddlebag. It was El Dorado Ridge that made him a legend, and then a phantom. They said he rode in with 12 mercenaries to break a mining strike. The miners fought back with picks and shovels. A dozen men fell before dawn, and when the sun rose, the dust was thick with screams and guilt. Colt put down his rifle, stared at the slaughter he'd been paid for, and something in him snapped like the neck of a man at the end of a rope. They buried El Dorado Ridge under dirt and shame, but the Grave Hand kept riding. Only now he rode like a man trying to outrun his own name. He would have died a year later in some no-name creek if not for a girl who never spoke. He remembered waking up half submerged in freezing water, the bullet just under his ribs, infection already clawing at his lungs. When his eyes cracked open, she was there. Barefoot, hair tangled, no more than 12. Josie Marrow didn't speak. She never did. She only dragged him up the bank, pressed pungent herbs to the wound, her dark eyes locked on his as if she could see right through his bones. He tried to push her away, half muttering curses between coughs of blood, but she hushed him with a finger to her lips. When he woke days later, the fever broken, she was gone. All that remained was the memory of those eyes, the only eyes that ever looked at him without flinching. Colt tried to bury her face in the bottom of every bottle. He took more bounties, spilled more blood, hoping each kill would drown that creek bed ghost. But the guilt only grew heavier. By the time he heard about the witch on Gallows Hill, he knew exactly who it was. And when they tied the noose around Josie Marrow's neck, the Grave Hand became a ghost with a purpose, riding one last time to pay the debt only silence had ever forgiven. If you listen close enough, Penance Ridge always whispered about the rot that crept under its sun-bleached boards. Most folk turned their heads, called it bad luck when cattle went missing or a boy turned up dead behind the saloon. But every secret in that town curled back to Mayor Silas Crowther, a man who wore the law on his chest like a polished star, but wielded it like a noose. His son, Nathan Crowther, was the worst of him. Mean as a snake with whiskey in his veins and a hunger for things best left in the dark. Nathan could swagger through town, shove his hand up a girl's skirt behind the stables, smash a bottle across a stable hand's face, and no one dared spit a word, because the father's coin could buy silence. And if coin failed, rope would do the rest. When Nathan Crowther was found foaming at the mouth, a satchel of dried herbs in his pocket, the town barely needed an excuse. Josie Marrow's mark on the bundle was enough. The mayor bellowed poison. The preacher wagged his holy finger. By nightfall, they were hammering up the scaffold, just east of the ridge where her mother's ashes still turned the soil bitter. But not everyone was blind. Eli Thorne, the blacksmith, had heard the boys drunken bragging the week before. Nathan crowed about mixing his own rot whiskey with a pinch of something to keep me burning. He'd laughed, spat, kicked the coals in Eli's forge. Eli knew the boy had gotten the herbs off a traveling peddler. The same poison root Josie would have never used, not even on the worst fever. Eli held that truth like a red-hot horseshoe pressed to his chest. He thought of telling the sheriff. He thought of standing up in church when they called her witch and healer turned killer. But then Silas Crowther's men came around at dusk, leaning in Eli's doorway, boots muddy with secrets. "You got a wife, Eli. 2 young'uns. Best keep your hammer to your iron, not your mouth." So Eli did. He watched from his forge when they dragged Josie through town, wrists bound, blood drying on her cheekbone. He saw the scaffold, fresh pine nailed over old scorched timber, the same oak that once held Clara Marrow's body, while the good folk of Penance Ridge watched her burn. When Josie's eyes met Eli's, he felt something break inside. He wanted to scream, to tell the truth that sat rotting behind his teeth. But all he could do was hammer a horseshoe he did not need, each strike ringing out like a lie too heavy to carry. And when the noose dropped, Eli Thorne turned away. Because in Penance Ridge, the gallows kept its ghosts well fed. The noose creaked as the preacher's voice broke. Wind tugged at Josie Marrow's hair, whipping it across her swollen cheek. The whole of Penance Ridge seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the drop, the final snap that would end the fear they dressed up as righteousness. But beneath her bare feet, the scaffold boards shivered like something alive, remembering another burning long ago. Then came the crack, not the snap of rope, but the thunder of a single rifle shot. The bullet tore through the thick cord just above Josie's head, unraveling fibers in slow motion. Splinters flew from the beam where the round buried itself, and the noose fell limp, useless like the lie it had been built on. For a heartbeat, Josie was weightless. The crowd gasped as she pitched forward into empty air, but they never saw her hit the ground. Because in that breathless space between life and death, a black stallion reared from the edge of the square, hooves thrashing, eyes rolling wild. In the saddle, Colt Everhart leaned low, reins clenched in one hand, the long rifle smoking across his back. Time split apart. He rose in the stirrups, boots grinding leather, and caught Josie under her arms just as she fell. The force of her weight rocked him back. His ribs screamed where an old bullet scar still ached, but he held on. He pulled her across the saddle before the townsfolk found their voices again. "Hang her if you dare," he snarled over the heads of the stunned crowd, his words more a growl than a vow. Someone fired a shot that went wide, sparking off the iron ring of the scaffold. The stallion lunged forward, dust exploding under its hooves, Colt's hat whipping from his head as he drove the beast through the gathering chaos. Behind them, curses rose like a storm. "Witch! Burn them both!" someone screamed. A rock flew past Josie's shoulder, but she didn't flinch. She pressed her face into Colt's back, her silence steady as the drumming of her heart beat against his spine. For a moment, he was 23 again, bleeding out in a creek bed, her tiny hands pressing bitter-smelling leaves to his ribs. The shots that cracked through the morning air were sharper than memory, but not louder. He could almost hear her voice in that hush behind the gunfire, though he knew she'd never speak it. He felt it instead, her pulse, the same soft thrum that once called him back from the edge. They hit the outskirts of Penance Ridge in a storm of gunfire and kicked up dust. Colt didn't look back. He knew if he did, the weight of all he'd done, all he'd failed to undo, would drag him straight off the horse. His revolver stayed cold in its holster. His only shield was the ghost in his arms. They cleared the ridgeline, the last rooftops falling behind like rotting teeth. The desert opened wide before them, heat shimmering off distant red rock. Each hoofbeat pushed them further from the gallows and closer to the ghosts they'd both carried for too long. As they thundered deeper into the wasteland, flashes of the past clawed at Colt's mind. Her small fingers on his fevered skin, the way she'd never looked away, even when he'd begged for the dark to take him. Her silence had damned him once, stitched his life together when he would have let it bleed out. Now it steadied him in the saddle, her arms locked around his ribs like a promise he hadn't earned, but would die to keep. Behind them, Penance Ridge howled its curses to the wind, but ahead the desert swallowed every sound, every bullet, every lie. Colt bent low over the horse's mane, felt Josie breathe against his shoulder, and let the weight of her heartbeat drown out the gunfire he knew would chase them all the way to hell, or to whatever chance at redemption waited beyond the dunes. They rode until the sun broke over the high desert like a knife edge, bleeding the last warmth from the rocks. Colt Everhart found what shelter he could, a split seam of earth where an old mine shaft sank into the bones of the ridge. Long abandoned, half collapsed, the entrance was framed by rotting timbers and black-streaked stone that smelled of rust and old sins. Inside, the air tasted like damp ash. Water dripped from cracks overhead, echoing in the dark like footsteps you couldn't name. Colt dragged a few dead branches from the brush outside, careful to keep the smoke low. His shoulder burned where the bullet had grazed him during the escape. A shallow wound but angry and raw, the kind that turned to septic fast in these badlands. Josie Marrow crouched near the small flickering fire, her hair a tangled curtain between him and her eyes. She laid out her bundles of dried herbs in neat rows on an old canvas sack. Mugwort, yarrow, bark scraped clean to a pale bone color. She didn't ask him to undress. She simply took his coat and shirt when he sat, her hands steady as stone. When her fingers pressed the poultice against his wound, Colt hissed through his teeth. He'd known worse pains. A gut shot at El Dorado Ridge, broken knuckles from brawls that left other men buried in shallow graves. But this hurt was different. It came wrapped in memory, in shame. "Josie!" he rasped, his voice almost lost in the hush of the cavern. She didn't look up. She smeared more of the bitter paste onto the cloth, worked it into the cut with a touch that stung enough to pull the truth from his throat. "I need you to hear me, girl." He laughed then, a raw, humorless sound that scraped the walls. "Hell, maybe you've always heard what nobody else did." Her hands paused. The shadows of the fire danced on the mine walls, flickering behind her like old ghosts waiting for the right lie to break. "I was sent for you," he said, eyes fixed on her silhouette. "Months back. Didn't even know your name at first." "Just a bounty," said the witch in Penance Ridge needed to vanish. "Silas Crowther's coin. Same coin that tied that rope round your throat." Josie turned her head slightly, the hair falling away from her face just enough for him to see her eyes. Those dark, unblinking wells that never gave him an inch to hide. "I took the bounty. Spent nights camped on that ridge above your cabin, watching your candle burn down to nothing. Figured I'd wait for you to come out alone. One clean shot, the grave hand's way." The fire cracked. A drip of water landed on the old rail tracks that led deeper into the mine. Colt swallowed, felt the confession cut through him, sharper than any blade. "But I couldn't do it." He let out a breath that trembled against the cold stone. "Every night I watched you tend some poor soul too sick to crawl. No coin changed hands. No curse slipped from your tongue. Just your hands and your silence, like you were daring the world to find one true word to hang you with." Josie said nothing. She dipped her rag into a tin cup, wrung out the herbs, pressed them once more to the wound on his shoulder. Her eyes never left his. They didn't have to. He wanted to beg, to say it plain, that he'd never pull that trigger, not for all the gold buried under Penance Ridge. But her silence pinned him open. laid every blood-stained piece of him bare. Sometimes, Colt Everhart thought, the ones who never speak see the deepest. He lowered his head, let the pain bite down, and when Josie's fingers brushed his skin, he wondered if forgiveness could live in the hush between two people who owed each other too much to say out loud. At dawn, a coyote's cry was the only warning. Down in the dry creek bed at the edge of the ridge, they found her. Martha Kane, the widow who once slipped bread to Josie Marrow when she was a starving child. She'd carried a note clutched in her apron pocket, a plea scratched in shaky ink. "They're coming for you. Run." She never got the chance to speak it out loud. The mayor's men cut her throat and left her for the buzzards. When Colt Everhart found her cold in the dirt, he didn't curse or pray. He just tied her shawl over her face, set a stone to mark the grave, and spat in the sand where her blood turned the earth dark. By the time the sun scraped its way over Penance Ridge, the air hung thick with rumors. Curtains twitched like nervous hands. Mothers dragged their children off porches as hooves echoed down the main road. Word spread faster than wildfire. The grave hand is riding in, and the witch is with him. No posse tried to stop them this time. The real law in that town had always been fear, and fear was brittle now. Colt rode slow, Josie Marrow sitting behind him on the black stallion. She kept one hand on the saddle horn, the other pressed to the small tin of dried flowers she'd picked from Martha Kane's grave. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. They stopped at the courthouse steps, the same boards where the mayor's boy once spat on her shadow. Mayor Silas Crowther waited under the porch's warped beams, flanked by two deputies who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Crowther's face was pale beneath the brim of his fine hat, sweat darkening his collar despite the morning chill. Colt swung down first, hand resting on the revolver at his hip. Not to draw, just to remind every soul watching what he was capable of. He turned, helped Josie off the horse. She stepped down onto the boards like she was stepping onto Gallows all over again. But her eyes didn't waver. Crowther cleared his throat, voice dripping with oil. "Look at this," he sneered, raising his hands for the small crowd gathering behind barrels and dusty windows. The witch and her bewitched dog, back from the desert to finish what she started. No one cheered. No one moved. Somewhere behind Colt, a baby began to cry, sharp and thin in the hush. He felt Josie shift beside him. The smallest thing, but enough to remind him she was made of something harder than rope. "Your boy drank himself dead on poison rot," Colt said, voice flat as a gravestone. "And you blamed her, so you didn't have to bear your own sins with him." "Lies!" Crowther spat, face mottled red. "She's always been a devil's child, just like her mother. She cursed this land, poisoned my Nathan." Josie stepped forward. Her shadow stretched over the boards like a scar they couldn't scrub out. She didn't lift her hands. She didn't speak. She only looked at the mayor, and then past him, at the people pressed against glass and door frames, watching. The more Crowther shouted, the more her silence spread like a crack through his power. His words sounded cheap next to the truth she carried in her eyes. Eli Thorne stood near the back, soot still on his sleeves from the forge. When Josie's gaze met his, he dropped his hammer to the dirt. The clang broke something open in the hush. "Say something, witch!" the mayor roared, his voice shaking now. He reached for the pistol at his side, a final bluff for the faithful few who still clung to his lies. "Tell them what you did." Josie didn't flinch. Her eyes were dark, bottomless, steady as the roots she carried in her satchel. She looked at Crowther like she was staring through him, past the badge, the lies, the gallows he'd built for her mother, then for her. Colt stepped closer but didn't draw. He didn't have to. The whole town was watching the real noose tightening, not around Josie's neck, but around Crowther's throat. Silas Crowther's hand shook as he lifted the pistol, but he didn't aim it at Josie. He pressed it to his own temple, eyes wide, sweat dripping from his jaw like confession. She still said nothing. And that was worse than any curse. One muffled crack split the morning air. When the echo died, the last of Crowther's power bled out onto the courthouse steps. Josie Marrow turned, her eyes sweeping over the folk of Penance Ridge, their heads bowed, their voices caught in their throats. She didn't offer them forgiveness. She didn't ask for it either. Her silence was enough to remind them they'd never bury what they'd done, not under all the desert dust in the world. When the last breath left Silas Crowther's lips, Penance Ridge fell silent, but the gallows still loomed on the hill east of town. Dark timber nailed over the bones of a tree that had once burned Josie's mother into the dirt. The people kept their distance. They watched from windows, hammers stilled mid-swing, horses tied up and forgotten. It was Colt Everhart who climbed the scaffold first. He didn't wear his guns for this. He brought only a pry bar in his own battered hands. Each nail he dragged from the boards shrieked like an old ghost. Splinters bit his palms, but he worked until sweat turned to salt in his eye, until the gallows was nothing more than a pile of rough planks and rusted bolts waiting to be fed to the fire. When the last beam fell, Colt lit the match himself. He stood watch while the timber burned down to ash and memory, the smoke curling into the sky like a prayer no one spoke aloud. Josie Marrow didn't stand beside him for the burning. Instead, she found the raw patch of earth where the scaffold had left its mark. There, with a dull spade and Colt's old tin bucket, she dug. Sand caved in on her wrists, rock scraped her knuckles raw, but she didn't stop until the ground coughed up the first shimmer of water, cold and clear, far below the scorched surface. She planted the seeds the next morning. Desert marigolds, Indian paintbrush, a handful of stubborn roots she'd kept wrapped in cloth since her mother's day. She pressed each bloom into the dirt like a promise, that no noose would grow here again, only flowers tough enough to bloom where blood once dried in the sun. Colt brought her water in the bucket, his shoulders raw from tearing out the old wood. He watched her kneel in the dust, tucking shoots into place with the same care she'd once used to pack his wounds. No words passed between them. None needed to. The flowers would speak enough when they opened their ragged petals to the wind. Years from now, folks would ride past the hill and see only a patch of stubborn color against the red dust. The well would still give water, and if they listened close enough, they might remember. Some gallows stand even when the rope is gone, but sometimes the quiet ones bury them, with flowers and silence. Some say the ghosts of Penance Ridge never really left that well on the hill. Maybe they linger in the flowers Josie planted, or in the old planks Colt burned to ash. But if this story teaches us anything, it's that some gallows stand long after the rope is gone, in the way we judge too fast, fear what we don't understand, or stay silent when we should speak up. In today's world, maybe we don't build scaffolds in the town square anymore, but we still build them in our words, our rumors, our small cruelties. We turn someone's quietness into something to fear, their difference into something to punish. Yet sometimes the strongest truth is the one spoken without a single word. Maybe that's why Josie's story still matters, because it reminds us that the ones who never shout are often the ones who see the deepest. And that forgiveness isn't loud. It's the quiet, stubborn blooming of something good where pain once took root. What do you think? Do you believe a town like Penance Ridge still exists in the corners of our modern lives? Would you stand up when it matters, or stay silent like the blacksmith who looked away? Let us know in the comments. What part of this story will stay with you? If you felt even a flicker of hope in Colt and Josie's quiet redemption, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes silence can speak louder than any gun. Thank you for riding with us through this wild tale. We'll see you on the next dusty trail.